Have you ever had a take so good that HBO themselves agree with you? Well, a few months back I did, and in today's video we're going to explore how I was right about The Last of Us and how HBO's adaptation and the changes made support my original thesis. Spoilers for the game and for the show. If you've only seen the TV adaptation or only played the game, then no worries. As long as you've experienced the story in one form or another, you're going to be able to follow the entire discussion in today's video. So let's get into talking about just how right I was. To start, a little bit of context. Last fall for Halloween, I wanted to make 2 videos on The Last of Us games. For those of you who don't know, which is probably most of you because I only have 500 subs, I write video essays. Sometimes on video games, sometimes on anime, and sometimes on movies. Point is, I wanted to do a double feature of sorts and discuss both of The Last of Us games on my channel. For the first game, the video focused on discussing what really made The Last of Us work and what made it tick. For my video about Part 2, it was focused and geared toward as a defense of The Last of Us Part 2 because that was a very controversial game. We will be focusing on my analysis on the first game in today's video. I'll have an end card for both of those videos at the very end if you're interested in checking them out. In my analysis video on The Last of Us Part 1, I went section by section and discussed the characters and moments that made up each respective section. I go on a few tangents in the video, but overall the focus was to discuss the characters and what made them tick, and the sections and what made them work. The goal of the video was to find the point of The Last of Us. Everyone always knew that it was about Joel and Ellie, but I always felt like it was a little bit more than just that. The ultimate conclusion that I come to in the video is that The Last of Us Part 1 is about loss and what characters will do to avoid that loss. Overall, I most definitely agree with 99% of the things I say in that video, but I do think I could have worded my thesis a little clearer. A better way to express this same thesis is The Last of Us is about human connection and how characters will fight to keep that connection or how characters deal with it when they lose that connection. I pretty much say that exact statement in my video with just a bit of variation. Joel and Ellie's journey together is the focus of the story, but the point of The Last of Us is to explore how people respond to loss and what lengths they'll go through to avoid it. Overall, the point is the same though. The thesis in my part 1 video that we just discussed is what was proven right by HBO's Last of Us adaptation. After watching the HBO adaptation and reading a few interviews with the people behind the show, it's clear that the adaptation was done with care. It's very rare for a film or TV series to be good when it's based off video games, but thankfully The Last of Us TV series is fantastic. It would be somewhat easy to just adapt this story and have it be good just due to how good the story is on its own 2 feet, but the writers didn't play it that safe. They did make changes, most of which are small, but each change that they made helps the story in some way. For example, the infected no longer have spores and instead spread by latching onto flower products. And biting. This change was done because acting in a gas mask is hard, so they nixed that part of the lore to help add drama to infected encounters through the actors acting. That change is pretty big, but most are small. Like the section of the story with Henry and Sam has been moved from Pittsburgh to Kansas City. This is likely done because in the game after the Pittsburgh section, Ellie and Joel are just suddenly in Jackson, and it's pretty unrealistic that they just walked all that way, and it's never really addressed how they got there. So they moved that bit of the story to a city further west so that way the walk to Wyoming feels a bit more believable. Ultimately though, the changes we're going to focus on are the changes made to the characters and their relationships and discuss how those changes support my original video's thesis. Now, not every little change necessarily supports my thesis, but a vast majority of them do. I have 3 main examples to discuss in this video that support my claim. There are more, but I'm not trying to write a second 45-minute video on The Last of Us Part 1. First up is probably the most obvious change that supports my claim. That is of course episode 3 and the changes made with Bill and Frank's story. In the games, we only meet Bill. Bill is pretty much the exact same in the HBO adaptation as he is in the game. One of the biggest changes made in this episode is the fact that Frank is still alive. In the games, he's dead. After you play through Bill's section in the game, you find a corpse hanging from a noose in a house. Bill indicates that this was his partner Frank, and you come to learn through his suicide note that Frank and Bill had a falling out, so Frank left and got bit while he was leaving. It's also never directly said that Bill and Frank were gay partners. It's very much implied, and you'd honestly have to be a little brain dead not to understand the implications, but it's not directly said. I think the main reason why it wasn't directly said was because The Last of Us came out in 2013. LGBTQ acceptance was definitely doing better than it was in the early 2000s, but LGBTQ representation wasn't really common or direct at the time still. The fact that Frank and Ellie were gay was honestly revolutionary for gaming at the time. Unfortunately, I honestly believe that if the characters' sexual identities were a bigger focus of the games, then the games would have gotten much more backlash similar to the level that The Last of Us Part 2 got. Ellie's sexuality is explored in the game's DLC and it was mostly received well, but I think a big reason for that is because most of the fan base was eased into her being gay through the implications you got in the game. If the DLC was just in the game from the start, I'm not sure it would have gone over very well in 2013. Again, I point to the backlash that The Last of Us Part 2 got for further exploring Ellie's sexuality. Anyway, that was a small tangent, so back to the HBO adaptation. So not only is Frank alive, but it's very clear that him and Bill are gay together. I think it's fairly obvious how this change supports my thesis. As a reminder, my thesis was that The Last of Us is about characters and human connection and the things they'll do to keep that connection. So we meet Bill at the start of the outbreak in the HBO adaptation, and he is everything you thought he was while playing the games. Bill was a doomsday prepper, and in this case it's paying off. Fedra is the governing body that takes control during the outbreak, and at one point they go around and round people up to take them to quarantine zones, and in some cases just take them to slaughter. Bill's town gets this treatment, but Bill stays behind and turns the town into his little fortress. Bill's trapped up town is iconic in the game, so it was pretty fun and cool to see Bill build out his home in the adaptation. The main feature and focus of the episode though is no doubt Bill and Frank. Fairly early on in the episode, Frank falls into one of Bill's many traps around his place. Honestly, Frank was lucky to have not run into one of Bill's gun traps first. Bill sees his trap is triggered on his CCTV system, and so he goes out to investigate. While he expected an infected, what he got was a dirty man who wanted food. After some convincing, Bill brings the guy in, and slowly over the course of their time together, Bill comes to trust the man and learns his name is Frank. I really like the sexual tension that builds throughout this scene. To start, there is no sexual tension, but instead just tension. Bill is a very paranoid man, and so he holds Frank at gunpoint for a good portion of their first day together. Throughout their meal, Bill starts to let his guard down ever so slightly until Frank eventually convinces him to play a piece on the piano, and afterwards they kiss. While Bill is slowly letting himself become comfortable around Frank, you can really feel the fear that fills Bill. The tension also slowly shifts from real tension to a more subtle tension as each character tries to navigate this situation and understand the other person. This tension carries over when the pair have sex shortly after. Bill is honestly terrified and excited, and you can clearly see and feel how he's feeling. As the episode moves on, it shows the pair living their lives together in the apocalypse and some of the relationship problems and people problems that they face. What we're going to focus on though is how the relationship comes to an end. When the show jumps back to present day, Bill and Frank are old. They've been together for over 15 years at this point, and unfortunately in the last few years, Frank's condition has been getting pretty bad. He's wheelchair bound and no doubt would be long dead if it wasn't for Bill's constant care and support, and thanks to their safe home they've built together. Frank tells Bill that today is his last day. They've discussed this previously because they have a whole plan. Frank is ready to die. He can hardly function anymore, and with his condition, if infected or bandits manage to get into the town, he will just be a liability. Bill isn't happy about Frank's decision, but he understands and accepts his decision and then gives his husband the day he desires. The plan was for Bill to mix a bunch of pills into Frank's wine so he could peacefully fall asleep with his final meal. Bill does this, but he also just mixes a bunch of pills into the bottle of wine beforehand. This is because Bill plans to die tonight as well. Frank didn't know this, but he quickly guesses it. So, the pair heads to bed where they both die together in each other's arms. In the game, Bill's story is much different. He's still grumpy and a prepper, but he's alive at the end of it all, and Bill's direct feelings aren't really explored past how his character reacts to seeing his dead partner. I think it's pretty easy to see how the changes made in HBO's telling of Bill and Frank's story supports my thesis about The Last of Us. The entire episode is about them finding human connection with each other, fighting to keep that connection alive in an emotional and physical sense, and finally, ending with a double intentional overdose because Bill couldn't live in a world without Frank. While I think that very obviously supports my thesis about The Last of Us being about human connection and not just Joel and Ellie, there is another detail to talk about here that I don't think is as obvious. While I've been watching HBO's Last of Us adaptation, I couldn't help but notice a lack of infected encounters. I personally love the adaptation, but there's still a big part of me that wishes we got some really intense horror stealth scenes with some of the infected. We do have some scenes with the infected, like with the horde at the end of Henry and Sam's story, but for the most part, the vast majority of infected and human encounters from the games have been cut. For the record, I'm writing and producing this video before the final episode drops, so if we get anything like that in the last episode, cool, but it doesn't really change my point. I don't think adding in a few action scenes or horror stealth scenes here and there would necessarily take away from the core of The Last of Us. However, the lack of those scenes is a clear indication of the writer's intention, in my opinion. The writers chose specifically to leave a lot of that out, and instead they spend the time that they have focused much more on the characters that fill out the world of The Last of Us. The writers definitely could have adapted some of the gameplay focused encounters from the games into the show. A great example of this is again the ending part of the Kansas City section. In that section, they adapt a sniper portion that takes place in the game really well. That to me is clear proof that they definitely could have adapted other gameplay focused sections of the game into the HBO show as well if they wanted to. However, the creators chose to focus instead on the characters and their relationships in the world of The Last of Us. Bill and Frank are shining examples of that. They could have had the episode mostly focus on going to the school to get the car battery like in the game, and if they wanted to get really spicy, they could have included the bloater fight that takes place there. Instead, Ellie never meets Bill or Frank in the HBO adaptation because the pair have been dead for a bit. Bill left Joel the keys to his truck and their transportation issue is solved and the pair heads on their way. Ellie and Joel are hardly in this episode despite being the main characters. Instead of doing the easy thing of creating a simple action-based episode with brief flashbacks to tell Bill's story, the adaptation team put the entire focus on Bill and Frank. Sure, they're not Ellie and Joel, but their story most definitely carries the core of what made The Last of Us click with so many people. Before we move on to the second change, I want to ask you to subscribe. You've watched over half of the video, so you're obviously enjoying it at least a little bit. If you don't subscribe, I'll move into the apartment next door and set 20 alarms from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. 5 minutes apart and never turn them off and let them beep until the timer runs out. And if you don't live somewhere that I can do that, then I'm gonna break into your house and I'm going to... Sorry about that. Just subscribe, okay? The second change that supports my original thesis are some of the changes made to Henry and Sam's story. First off, let's talk about the gang that runs Kansas City. In the game, all of this takes place in Pittsburgh. Just remember that. I don't want to bring it up every time I switch between talking about the game and the show. The gang in the game and in the show are pretty similar. Their backstories and their prospective rise to powers are different, but the end result is the same. The city is controlled by a group of people that kill outsiders and take their shit. In the game, it's a group of hunters who've controlled the area for a while, and in the show, it's a revolutionary group that recently came to power. There are two specific changes made in the adaptation that really matter for this video. First off, Kathleen. She is a new character who runs Kansas City. Her brother was a major figure in their revolutionary movement, and she took control after he was killed by Fedra. She's a dictator who is absolutely fueled by rage. She represents the core theme that fuels The Last of Us in a different way, but she definitely still fits. While she was able to complete her brother's dream and overthrow Fedra, she then proceeds to twist his dream as she takes control and just becomes a new type of evil. The loss of her brother consumes her completely and ultimately destroys his dream and the movement's original intentions. If we look at my original, more sloppy wording of my thesis on The Last of Us, where I say The Last of Us is about loss and how we deal with the loss or fight to avoid it, I think it's safe to say that Kathleen's addition to the story reinforces this key element. The second change is more of an addition than a change. Henry and Sam have a few different changes to their story compared to the games. The biggest is that Sam is deaf in the adaptation, but the most important change is in the pair's backstory. Kathleen's brother was the leader of the revolutionaries back when Fedra was in control, and so Fedra was trying to find him. Henry is the one who sold him out to Fedra. He ratted out the guy to the feds just so he could get some life-saving medicine for Sam. I love this addition to their backstory. In the game, it was obvious how much the brothers cared for each other, but this added backstory really adds weight to things. We get to see just how far Henry is willing to go to save his little brother. It not only reinforces the brothers' relationship, but it also helps reinforce Henry as a character and the overall theme of people fighting to keep what family they have in this hell alive. The pair still have their tragic end with Sam getting bit by an infected, then he attacks Ellie, Henry shoots him. The acting in this scene is really incredible. Lamar Johnson's performance as Henry is so good. He really sells the character, and his acting in this final scene will make anyone cry. The scene is just as good and powerful in the game, but I was just so impressed with how well you're able to read everything going on in Henry's mind moment to moment as a viewer just by looking at the actor's face. The acting is of course incredible all around in the adaptation. Pedro Pascal has become an internet heartthrob. Hey, sexy lady. And Bella Ramsey has proved all of the haters wrong by being an incredible Ellie.
Tell them that Ellie is a little girl who broke her fucking finger!
The last change that I want to talk about that reinforces my thesis is immensely amplified by Pedro Pascal's incredible acting. Like I mentioned, I believe there are plenty of other examples that support my original thesis, but for the sake of time, I wanted to just discuss the three main, clearest, and best supporting ones. The final of these examples we're going to discuss are the changes made between Tommy and Joel's conversation when the pair are discussing having Tommy take Ellie all the way to the Fireflies. Joel's character isn't really changed in the HBO adaptation, but instead we get to dig a little bit deeper into the character. In the game, we don't really get to see a lot of Joel's specific thought processes and struggles when he's deciding whether or not to take Ellie to Colorado. You have the scene at the ranch followed by a quiet ride back to Jackson. Once everyone's back at Jackson, Joel kind of just decides to take Ellie with little explanation and apology. I don't think this is necessarily bad because through the transitional scenes and through the musical score, you as a player are kind of able to understand where Joel's head is at, and you can feel him get over his issues and change his mind. Joel is also a big tough man who clearly struggles to share his feelings. So it also fits his character to not expressly apologize to Ellie and just instead change his demeanor and tone. I do love the original approach taken in the game, and it's powerful. That being said, I always felt like something was missing, and I think the HBO adaptation nails that missing piece. The adaptation does a lot of things different with the Jackson section, but the most important change is in the addition of a very emotional conversation between Joel and Tommy. Joel wants Tommy to take Ellie just like he wants him to in the games. In the game, it feels like Joel is reluctant to take Ellie, but in the HBO adaptation, the impression that Joel gives off is that he's afraid. For the most part, Joel is Joel just like he is in the games. He starts reluctant, but slowly starts to warm up to Ellie as the story moves on until the Jackson section where he comes to fully realize how much he cares for this girl. Their journey together is of course fantastic in the game, but the HBO adaptation adds a little twist. Joel is afraid and getting weak. Joel is old in the games too, but the adaptation really makes an effort to show off Joel's age in moments with scenes like the ones that show off his building deafness. The adaptation also makes an effort to show off Joel's fears by focusing on his panic attacks. All of this builds to an emotional conversation between Joel and Tommy. The pair talk in the games of course, but it feels very much more like a business between bros conversation rather than a heartfelt and emotional one. The conversation in the adaptation though has Joel break down to his brother and really finally express himself. Joel is pensive and hesitant to talk about Tessa's death in the game and in the show, but here when talking to Tommy, it's the first time that Joel is able to open up about her death a little in the adaptation. It's only a couple lines and Joel is mainly talking about Ellie in those lines, but it's still a really important detail to include in the conversation. It instantly indicates how vulnerable Joel is being right now to Tommy. As the focus moves forward, Joel expresses a lot of struggles, insecurities, and fears to his brother and is crying through it all. This scene is very powerful and a fantastic addition to The Last of Us. The scene really rips Joel open and lets us read him like a book. This scene also 100% supports my thesis from my first video. Joel has found human connection again. At first, Ellie was just cargo, but now he started to care for this kid like she's his own daughter, and that absolutely terrifies him. Ultimately though, Joel realizes he needs to be the one to protect her. He needs to do everything in his power to keep this girl safe. This is of course the same character arc that we see Joel go through in the games, but the addition of this very emotional scene really opens Joel up more as a character to you as a viewer and a player. Overall, the HBO adaptation of The Last of Us is absolutely fantastic. There are things you can nitpick, and I would agree with a few of those nitpicks, but at the end of the day, what we got is a fantastic telling of The Last of Us story. As we've been discussing in the video, I think a major reason why the adaptation works so well is because the writers really focused on what made The Last of Us tick. Instead of putting time and effort towards action sequences or horror sequences, the Last of Us adaptation team decided to put their full focus and energy on changes that would channel the true core of The Last of Us. They expand many of those characters in the world, and those character expansions all support my thesis from my original video last fall. The Last of Us is about loss and what we'll do to avoid that loss. Or, worded differently, The Last of Us is about human connection and the things we'll do to keep that connection. Thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed, because if you're not, you know what's coming to you. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.
Don't you worry, it'll be okay. Don't you worry, I'm gonna get paid. Don't you worry, it'll be okay. Don't you worry, spit it come, you make my life